Welcome back to this session on the preface to the lyrical ballads. In the earlier sessions, we just tried to find out why William Wordsworth had decided to write the preface to the lyrical ballads. Now, it is important for us to understand the choice of poems and the other aspects related to the preface to the lyrical ballads. Let us move on to trying to understand why William Wordsworth gave a lot of importance to this preface. The choice of poems. When a poet publishes a volume of verses, his commitment to the readers is established concomitantly, and he makes an unwritten contract with his readers. The readers who would read his verse would expect the poet to try to find out their tastes and provide them with the kind of pleasure they are familiar with. However, his readers, who are used to the neoclassic poetry of Pope, and his followers would find that his poems are of a different kind. In writing the preface, his purpose is to explain to his readers his reasons for writing poems which were so different, unusual, and diverse from the earlier period. Whatever I have mentioned so far is very important for you to understand, because these points are vital to our understanding of why Wordsworth decided to write the preface. He wanted to establish a contact with the readers, and in this way the readers would be made aware of the changed perception and conception of poetry and not feel disappointed at the radical transformation that has taken place. Let us now move on to the themes of the poems that were included by Wordsworth. Wordsworth points out that he has written the present poems with a definite purpose in mind. This fact helps us to understand that Wordsworth had intentionally diverged himself from the neoclassical school of poetry. His purpose is to choose incidents and situations from common life and describe them as far as possible, I quote Wordsworth, in a language really used by men. Wordsworth specifically uses the phrase in a selection of language really used by men. By relating common situations and incidents and using imagination, he aims at presenting the poems in an unusual manner. Students must understand that the word unusual does not mean something very different. Wordsworth was trying to say that the poems that he would write were very different from the poems that were written during the neoclassical age. And so, he would present the poems in an unusual manner and make them interesting by tracing in them the primary laws of human nature. He discards the gaudy phraseology that was used during the neoclassical period, the use of artificial diction and sophisticated themes of neoclassical poetry, and create freshness in outlook by including the simple and natural life of the countryside. Now, this aspect is very important because so far the poetry written by the neoclassics did not include the simple life of the rustics. Wordsworth deliberately chose various aspects of humble and rustic life, and he gives us the reasons for the same. He says that, let's move on to the first point, the essential and innermost passions of the human heart find unrestrained, free and frank expressions in humble and rustic surroundings. This point is very, very important, and the main reason why it is important is because the Romantics gave a lot of importance to subjectivity. The second point, the elementary feelings of a human heart exist in a condition of greater simplicity in rustic conditions of life rather than in sophisticated city societies, and hence are communicated more accurately and forcefully without reserve. This aspect that I have just mentioned is quite important because the neoclassics gave a lot of importance to the experiences of people who lived in cities. Now, Wordsworth was against this. He said, it's not only the people in the cities who are important, but also those who live in the countryside. Let us now move on to the manners of the rustic life that Wordsworth wanted to say. The manners of rustic life originate from elementary feelings. Wordsworth purposely used the word elementary feelings to tell us that these feelings come from the heart of the rustics. Social vanity does not prevent the rustics from a frank expression of feeling. This means that the life in the city, the people in the city, were vainglorious, and often true feelings do not come out. Wordsworth's aim is to understand human nature that can be understood best in the simple conditions of rustic life. Let us now try to understand what Wordsworth meant by saying human passions are associated with the beatest forms of external nature, and so they are nobler and permanent than the emotions of the city dwellers that do not associate with nature as intimately as the rustics do. Now, this point that I just mentioned is very important for us to understand the romantic theory of poetry, because the neoclassics concentrated only on the emotions of the city dwellers, and the city dwellers were not in any way associated with nature. This was quite different in the case of the rustics, who maintained a permanent contact with nature. According to Wordsworth, the humble surroundings of rustic life are more natural and unrestrained, and so this becomes a proper subject of study for a poet who must write, I quote Wordsworth, on man, on nature, and on human life. The feelings and passions of the humble village farmers, shepherds, woodcutters, leech gatherers, among others, are universal. They are not peculiar to them alone, but are common to all mankind. We now move on to one of the definite aspects of what Wordsworth wanted to say, that is the language employed. Now, when I say the language employed, I would like to remind you that Wordsworth concentrated on the language that was used by man. His theory or his treatise on the language employed by man was quite different from what was understood in the previous age. Moreover, Wordsworth's ideas on the language employed created a lot of confusion among the other writers of this period. What sort of a confusion was created is what we have to understand. Did everybody agree to what Wordsworth had to say regarding language is what we have to see. Wordsworth's notion of the language that has to be employed for poetic creation was admired and criticized for several reasons, and the foremost critic to have commented on Wordsworth's use of language was Coleridge. We will know more about what Coleridge had to say in the next sessions, but for now, let us move on to what Wordsworth had to say. Wordsworth's principles ushered a fresh outlook into artistic intelligibility and appreciation by common man. One must understand that the poetry that was written during the neoclassic period was intelligible only to the people of the cities and the educated or the learned. Wordsworth diverged from the view of the neoclassics because he felt that the poems that were written had to be enjoyed and appreciated by the common man too. After getting rid of the slang, coarseness, faulty syntax, and other defects of the language of the rustics, the poet has adopted the ordinary language for these poems because the people living in rustic surroundings hourly communicate with the best objects from which the best part of human language is originally derived. Human feelings find simple and unelaborated expressions in rustic language. As the rustics move within confined spaces, adhering to the limited knowledge they hold, their language is more passionate, vivid, and forceful, and simple without any pretension. This aspect was very important for Wordsworth because he found that the rustics who lived every day not only within themselves but also with nature, found best expression of their feelings when they were in association with nature. The precision and philosophy of rustic language makes it conducive to understanding common emotions than the artificial diction of those poets who, in order to please a deprived public taste, cut themselves off from the language and feeling of common men. Let us now move on to find out what were the objectives of the poems that Wordsworth wrote. Wordsworth points out that his poems differ from the popular poetry of the times. He meant the poetry of the neoclassical age. They were neither trivial nor mean in language or in thought. Each poem in the lyrical ballads has been written with a worthy purpose, that of enlightening the readers and thereby purifying their affections. The poet possesses the habit of meditation, and this practice modifies and regulates his feelings. The sentiments he has expressed would definitely enlighten the understanding of his readers and purify and strengthen their emotions. Poetry, I quote Wordsworth, is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and that it takes its origin from emotions recollected in tranquility. These two phrases are very important, and they form the basis or the crux of what Wordsworth wanted to say by his definition of poetry. Wordsworth lays special emphasis on powerful emotions and intense feelings. Now, these two are considered to be the qualities which the poetry of the preceding age, that is, the neoclassical age, lacked. Wordsworth started from an interest in life rather than art. The word spontaneous in Wordsworth's definition is very important. It is not the literal meaning of the word spontaneous, which means immediate or sudden. The word spontaneous connotes natural or unforced. The poet who possesses the capacity to reconstruct his earlier emotions and feelings is not solely concerned with the imitation of the external. His art externalizes the internal, and the feelings become the primary source of poetic creation. Once again, Wordsworth has emphasized feelings and emotions that are very important for poetic creation. A poet is a man of unusual and exceptional organic sensibility, albeit he is also a man of thought. Wordsworth goes on to describe the poet. He finds the poet to be a person who is very different from the ordinary, because the poet's feelings are modified by his thoughts. The thoughts that arise in the mind of a poet are not the thoughts of the ordinary man. He is able to connect one thought with another, in the sense that he is able to transfer his thoughts to the other. He is able to associate his thoughts with the other, and this way discover what is really important and worthwhile. In course of time, such perceptions become habitual, and so habitually he writes of subjects and expresses sentiments which are noble and worthwhile. The poet writes about sentiments that are more important than action and situation. This is the point that we have to give importance to, because all poets give importance to sentiments that are considered to be very important in the process of writing poems. It is these sentiments that give importance to actions and situations. Usually, actions and situations create sentiments, but in this case, it is the sentiments that give importance to actions and situations. Let us now move on to finding out what should be the response of the human mind according to Wordsworth. The human mind, according to Wordsworth, can be excited and interested even without the use of sensationalism. His aim in writing the lyrical ballads is to show that men have lost the power to discriminate between the great and noble works of Shakespeare and Milton and the cheap, sensational literature of their own day. It is important for us to note that Wordsworth gave a lot of importance to Shakespeare and Milton. This objective is an important one in the contemporary age. The insipid and rather monotonous lives of a large number of people in crowded cities make them search for excitement through sensationalism for uncommon incidents and situations. This factor is very important because the neoclassic age gave a lot of importance to the lives of the people who lived in crowded cities, and people in cities were exposed to the other media like films, and through films or even presentation of dramas, they searched for cheap sensationalism. Wordsworth was against this propagandization of cheap sensationalism. This craving is satisfied by the media, as I said before, and other forms of cheap literature. Let us try to understand what we would mean by cheap literature. Cheap literature meant those books which were sold in the streets and those materials that contained insubstantial material on the works of the earlier authors. They yearn for unusual incidents and situations and fail to perceive the beauty and dignity of the common and the usual. This aspect is very important because the situations and incidents that were chosen by the people of the neoclassic age were relevant to their lives, which were as bad or as equally irrelevant or insipid as they lived. However, Wordsworth wanted to give more dignity to human life. That is why he believed that the beauty and dignity of common life has to be appreciated, and this could be done better only in the literature of the Romantic age. Wordsworth's purpose in this collection of poems has been to arouse the failing sensibilities of the age and to show that the human mind can be excited even without the use of the uncommon and the sensational. It is a common practice among men to look for cheap sensation. Wordsworth was against this feeling in man that actually went behind the use of uncommon and unrelated or even sensational events. Wordsworth wasn't interested in such casual remarks or in such casual excitement. He has hopes of success in his purpose for some of the reasons. Let us now enunciate the reasons that Wordsworth gives us. Firstly, the human mind has an inherent love of the noble and dignified, and secondly, there are certain noble and permanent subjects which always excite the interest of the human mind. The second point that I just mentioned now regarding noble and permanent subjects which excite the interest of the human mind are very important as far as Wordsworth is concerned. The main reason for this is because Wordsworth wanted to distinguish the human mind that was perceived in the neoclassic age with that of the Romantic period. Thirdly, there are a number of men of greater power in these ages who work against this evil. By evil, Wordsworth meant cheap sensationalism or the move into understanding works that were of no quality at all. Let us now move on to the approach of Wordsworth's poems. Wordsworth asserts that he has not used abstract ideas. This concept of abstract ideas is important because the common man or the people living in the rustic areas weren't used to ideas that were abstract. They believed more in raw feelings, raw emotions, emotions that were attached to human natures in their communion with nature. The use of being a common practice of contemporary poets to elevate their style and raise it to a level above prose. His purpose has been to use, I quote the word by Wordsworth, the very language of men. Men use personification only when they are emotionally excited, and he too has restricted their use for such occasions. He has never used personification as merely a mechanical stylistic device. Now, this point is very important as far as a student of literature is concerned, because the use of personification or any figure of speech, according to Wordsworth, is not used for a mechanical purpose, in the sense that the use of such figures of speech carry greater significance or are very important as far as the usage is concerned. We will go more about that, or we will deal with more about that in the further sessions. Wordsworth has taken great pains to avoid the use of all those poetic devices which are collectively, constitutively called poetic diction. Poetic diction. Diction means the choice of words. Poetic diction has been evaded by the poet in order to bring his language nearer to the language of men, so that his poems may impart the pleasure which is proper to poetry. This particular phrase, pleasure which is proper to poetry, is of great importance. Let us find out why it is so. Wordsworth has looked steadily at his subject, and so has dealt with it accurately and realistically. In other words, Wordsworth has been true to nature and has used a natural style. He has expressed his ideas in a language befitting the respective importance of each genre of literature. Wordsworth's use of language is accurate and sensible, though this has compelled him to avoid the use of phrases and figures of speech that have traditionally been used by poets. This part of understanding Wordsworth is very important, because poets of the earlier age used personification or other parts of speech, or other figures of speech to be exact, in order to create artificiality in their poems. But Wordsworth wasn't so. He used words, or he used phrases, or he used figures of speech so that they blend easily with the emotions that had to be created. Let us now move on to the language of prose and poetry as explained by Wordsworth. Before moving into describing the language of prose and poetry as described by Wordsworth, it is important for us to note that the same topic has been discussed by Coleridge also in his Biographia Literaria. But the idea that Wordsworth conveyed through his meaning of the use of language of poetry and prose is remarkably different from what Coleridge had to say. Wordsworth says that critics in general think it a great defect if they come across a series of lines in which the language, though naturally arranged and according to the law of meter, does not differ from that of prose. Wordsworth affirms that even in the best poetry, important passages have an order of words which is similar to good prose combinations. The difference between the two arises only in the use of meter. This means that Wordsworth was giving a lot of importance to meter, and he finds that the use of meter is crucial to the understanding of the difference between prose and poetry. In order to illustrate, or in order to explain his theory better, he gives us an example from a sonnet of Thomas Gray, who always stressed the difference between prose and metrical composition to prove that even in his poetry, the language of significant lines is in no respect different from that of prose. In order to explain this further, Wordsworth quotes two lines from the sonnet on the death of Richard West. I quote the two lines. I fruitless moan to him that cannot hear and weep, the more because I weep in vain. Let us examine the two lines that are given to us. Wordsworth says that it is quite obvious that except in the use of the single word fruitless for fruitlessly, which is so far a defect, the language of these lines does in no way differ from that of prose. Wordsworth therefore concludes that, I quote Wordsworth, there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. They are closely similar in their nature, function and appeal. They employ similar materials that arise from a related source and appeal to comparable faculties. With this distinction that Wordsworth makes between prose and poetry, let us now move on to the choice of words that Wordsworth gives importance to, which is titled Poetic Diction. There are views that suggest that poetry differs from prose, and the use of poetic diction is one of the sources of pleasure as rhyme and meter, and so its usage is correspondingly justified. Wordsworth disagrees with such views. He recommends the use of, I quote Wordsworth, selection of language really used by men, unquote. Now, if this selection is made with true taste and feeling, the language of poetry would be free from the coarseness and vulgarity of ordinary life. In his own poems, Wordsworth has tried to use such a language which is regarded to be a distinction. The addition of meter to it becomes a further source of pleasure. Let me go back to telling you about the selection of language really used by men. This particular phrase that Wordsworth uses, selection of language really used by men, was highly disregarded by the critic Coleridge. Of course, Wordsworth and Coleridge were friends, but Coleridge decided to object the use of this phrase, language really used by men. And in Biographia Literaria, Coleridge tells us why he objects to the use of language really used by men. We would discuss about all that in our session that is related to Coleridge's Biographia Literaria. Let us continue with what Wordsworth has to say about poetic diction. According to Wordsworth, meter is not essential for poetry, for there can be poetry even without meter, and Wordsworth considers meter to be pleasure superadded. So far, we have discussed what Wordsworth had to say about the language and that of poetic diction. We should now understand in what way is Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction very important. It is also noteworthy to find out those aspects in his theory of poetic diction that were favored by many critics. Wordsworth opposes the inane phraseology of the lifeless verse of the time. When I say of the time, I mean of the neoclassic period, and favors an impassioned love of simple words and the poetic effects latent in them. The meaning of the word latent is hidden, in the sense that Wordsworth wanted to say that the use of phrases or the use of words was lovely, it was important, it was appropriate, but these words contained a certain power, and this power was hidden. It is not only the poet, but also the reader who has to find out the effect that these words have. These are the two noteworthy aspects of Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction. Wordsworth denounces the use of personification, cliches, trite mythology and the like of the neoclassical school. It would be appropriate for us to find out what he meant. Personification relates to those figures of speech that were common or that were commonly understood by the people of the age. Cliches are often repeated phrases or often repeated words. Trite mythology refers to those characters or those insignificant characters who are brought into poetry to make it sound elaborate or to make it sound very different. All these were objected to by Wordsworth. Wordsworth's celebrated line in the poem Michael, allow me to quote that line, and never lifted up a single stone, unquote, is a classic example of his theory of poetic diction that serves as a corrective to the artificial diction prevalent in his own times. Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction, however, has its limitations and contains contradictions. Earlier in my lecture, I did mention about some of the drawbacks or some of the points regarding poetic diction that were opposed to by several critics. Let us now move on to understand what were the limitations of Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction. Wordsworth's love of plain language does not preclude the frequent borrowing of apt phrases from other poets. His diction is, in fact, more literary than is commonly recognized. Under the influence of his fine imagination, he produced the imposing poem Ode, intimations of immortality from recollections of early childhood, which was followed by lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour, and Ode to Duty, the diction of which could never be within the comprehensibility or common speech of the rustics. This is in fact what Coleridge also was emphasizing. According to Coleridge, Wordsworth violates his own rules in many of his poetic compositions, and it can be asserted that he is at his best only in those poems in which he does not adhere to his own principles of poetic diction. Whatever Coleridge had observed so far was very, very important as far as our understanding of the greatness of Wordsworth is concerned. This drawback that Coleridge points out does not in any way reduce the worth of the contribution of Wordsworth. Let us now move on to finding out the relationship of passion, style and diction as proposed to us by Wordsworth. Wordsworth moves on to tell us about a poet. What could a poet do? How should a poet speak? And in what way is the speech of the poet very significant or important as far as the audience is concerned or the reader is concerned? A poet may either speak in his own person or employ the characters to speak on his behalf. In most of Wordsworth's poems, we find Wordsworth to be the speaker or his characters speak on Wordsworth's behalf. When speaking through his characters, he must use a language proper to the situation and the deportment of the characters. The use of any artificial or foreign metaphors, figures of speech or other devices to decorate and elevate the style would be incongruous and inappropriate. Now, this point is very important because Wordsworth stressed the use of figures of speech, but he was very particular when he said that the use of such figures of speech should in no way interfere with our liking for a poem. Generally, when adjectives or figures of speech or even artificial language is used in our explication of poems, we find that these stylistic devices stand apart. They wouldn't match, or they wouldn't be in harmony, or they wouldn't be in synchronicity with the style of the poem or the theme of the poem. The use of artificial diction would be rendered as superfluous. The passions which the poet wants to convey, if judiciously chosen, would naturally elevate the style and enliven it with suitable metaphors and similes. Therefore, Wordsworth concludes that the primary object is the emotion which the poet seeks to convey. This means that Wordsworth wasn't giving importance to the choice of words alone, but the emotions that would be raised or the emotions that would arise from conveying the meaning that has to be conveyed. The noble emotions would by themselves elevate and dignify the language. The style employed in each genre of literature should vary according to the magnitude and immensity of the emotion and passion that has to be conveyed. passions of a milder nature must be expressed in a passive and temperate language. Now, temperate language means a language that is controlled, while nobler and more elevated passions must make use of an equally elevated and metaphorical language. In this way, the style would acquire the charm of variety, and the effectiveness of the more elevated passion would be heightened. Wordsworth demonstrates the usefulness of artificial and unnatural poetic devices championed by Pope and his followers. Let us now summarize what we have done in this session. Wordsworth believes that it would be better if a poet could write about rustic life and choose the language of the rustics to write poems, because the rustics communicate with the eminent objects that are the source of the best parts of human language. Wordsworth asserts that there cannot be any difference between the language of prose and metrical composition because of the employment of similar materials and the appeal to similar faculties. According to Wordsworth, meter is not essential for poetry, for there can be poetry even without meter. Meter is merely an ornament that adds to pleasure derived from poetry. Wordsworth demonstrates the futility of using artificial and unnatural poetic devices as employed by Pope and his followers. In order to understand Wordsworth's theory better, we have a couple of questions, or in fact many questions for you to answer. And I do hope that after answering the questions, you would have a better understanding of what Wordsworth wanted to say in his preface to the Lyrical Ballads. With more to follow, let us meet in the next session. Until then, bye.